Welcome to the Fatigue Files, a podcast that explores fatigue conditions from as many angles as possible while pushing the boundaries of thinking about fatigue as a signal to the 21st century and beyond. Cutting-edge thinking, practical strategies, thought-provoking explorations. They're going to all be here, and I'm your host, Anna Greer, welcoming you to this edition of the Fatigue Files. So today, everybody, I have a wonderful guest with me, Barbara J. Hunt, who is a forgiveness enthusiast, a personal development and spiritual coach. She works on bespoke retreats in Somerset. She's the best-selling author of Forgiveness Made Easy, and she leads online forgiveness field experiences. Wow. So welcome, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Anna. Pleasure.
So I have to ask, first off, what is a forgiveness field experience?
Well, a forgiveness field experience is an online, like a masterclass, but we're specifically looking at forgiveness. And I call it a forgiveness field for two reasons. So one is because of that beautiful poem by Rumi, which says, "Out beyond of right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there." I really like the idea that it's away from all of our judgments and expectations. So we're in a almost like sacred space, somewhere where we're doing that kind of work. And then the other idea comes from Charles Eisenstein. You've probably heard of his work. He's an ecologist and a big thinker. And he wrote the book, The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible. And he said every time someone forgives, it adds to the field of forgiveness. Like there's a resonance of it, and you add to that when you do it. So when we do a forgiveness field, everyone comes online. I do a little bit of introduction, a bit of preparation work, lead the whole group through a forgiveness process. So there's the 7 steps that I wrote in my book, the 7-step Forgiveness Made Easy process. And I take everyone through it all at the same time. So everyone works with their microphones off. So they're in the privacy of their own space. So as long as they're not overheard where they are, they feel free to participate fully, but they're not exposing themselves, like in terms of sometimes people are very sensitive to, and there's a lot of shame around what we resent. And so you're not having to share that. You're doing it out loud in your own space. And then I take everyone through the whole process. And usually people are surprised by how profound it is. And I often have people say, "Oh, I thought I'd forgiven them, but I didn't realize there was so much still in there."
Yeah, really fascinating. I'm really struck by that chord there. Well, 2 chords really strike me. One is the idea of the collective nature of consciousness and the contribution to that in this practice. And the other is the shame associated with resentment. And I suspect as well there's a fear of vulnerability, isn't there, in relation to forgiveness?
Absolutely.
So I'm curious to know how you define forgiveness.
I will tell you, and can I just respond back to what you've just said, because it's beautiful that you picked up on those 2 things, because I think that when we do forgive, there is a collective that we impact, but also there's some kind of magic that happens that I witness all the time. When someone forgives, they are often surprised that the other person does things. I get this sometimes when I used to work on the retreats. We do a forgiveness process with somebody, and then a bit later on, either that day or on that week, they go, "You'll never guess what, my sister stroke mother brother texted me and said blah blah blah." They never say that. So things happen when one person shifts. There's almost like there is an energetic connection between us and the other people, and something changes when you let go, which is so that is amazing. And then to your second point about shame, one of the things that I am also really an advocate for is everyday forgiveness. So it's not necessarily the big kind of inspiring, incredible stories of people who have managed to forgive atrocities, heinous crimes, like really terrible things. My teaching is much more about everyday forgiveness.
Mm.
The small things that happen, the things that we think we shouldn't even be resenting. And
Yeah.
my own particular story was about forgiving my mum for having multiple sclerosis. So she was ill from the time I was 15, and that had a massive impact on my family and me, and obviously, all of us. But I didn't know I was resenting her for it, because I wouldn't let myself admit that I was resenting her.
Mm.
And resentment, I kind of use a bit of a scale of resentment. So right from like a little grudge or a grievance or a, they shouldn't be doing that, whatever it is. We're always judging other people all the time. So anytime we're wanting to be different, really, I would count as some kind of grievance. A bit like putting the brakes on. You just got the
Yeah.
brakes on slightly. That they shouldn't be like that. They should be more like how I want them to be. And so as soon as you've got some kind of judgment going, that can then collect. Then you kind of get whole, those dust balls that move, like those things that roll across the desert, where they gather more and more to them, and they eventually become these enormous kind of plant things that, so our resentment's a bit like that, kind of gathers to itself other crimes, which are not big deal, someone, but our resentment often is about our judgments, and is always our judgments, and what we think shouldn't be happening,
Mm.
and is much more to do with us really than the other person. And we store it inside our hearts. A lot of the time we're not aware of it, and a lot of them, we don't know what to do about it either.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that there's a kind of resistance and control in that, and both resistance and control produce a kind of tension in the nervous system, don't they? They're not neither of those responses, whether it's a kind of resistance to what's happening, this shouldn't be happening, a kind of hardening, no matter how subtle, or the attempt to control the outcomes rather than simply letting go and surrendering to what is, which is the ultimate position of healing and relaxation. Um,
Yes.
you can imagine then that over time, these small acts of unforgiveness can actually become sclerotic, become a problem in a life that really needs unpeeling. And how do you go about that? How do you go about exploring that and unpeeling it?
And I really love what you're saying, is that there's a hardening, there's a shutting down, and there's reasons why we hold on to our resentment. But I just want to go back to how do I define forgiveness, because it's really
Oh,
important.
yes,
I
good
think
point.
I think one of the reasons why we have trouble with forgiveness is because we think it means things that it doesn't. We
Mm.
think it means, oh, well, then I'll have to reconcile with them, or I have to let them back in my life again, or it's like saying it's okay and it was never okay. And there is a difference between saying I'm willing to forgive somebody for something and saying I'm not going to say that maybe it was illegal, maybe it was actually a criminal act, maybe it was something that was deeply unfair. You would still pursue justice or restorative justice. It doesn't mean that you don't do those things. It just means your heart is not stuffed up with resentment. And the weight of the resentment, I think we often are not conscious of it, because it serves two purposes. We get something out of it, and we're not aware of that. But also, it's like you were saying about vulnerability, it stops us being vulnerable. So the death that I use for forgiveness comes from one of my first teachers about forgiveness, K. Bradford Brown. And he said, forgiveness is the absolute refusal to hold ill will against someone for what they did or didn't do. And I'll say it again because it's quite long. Forgiveness is the absolute refusal to hold ill will against someone for what they did or didn't do.
That's amazing.
I really like it because it's so clear, and it means that you're the one who's doing the absolute refusal. So it's a bit like you're not a little bit pregnant, you either are or you're not. You're not like maybe. So it's the same with resentment. So you're either holding it or you've let it go. Like if I was holding onto a rope and you were on the other end, you would definitely know if I'd let it go. Um, so that's sort of the intention, and it gives you something to then do, because there's lots of teachings about forgiveness because I do sort of see what other people are teaching about it and what's the sort of feel for forgiveness. And to me, there's much misunderstanding that we're not even on the page that says okay, forgiveness is important and let's do it. We're still like, well, you shouldn't forgive that. That's unforgivable. You know, you hear governments saying so and so, you know, that's an unforgivable act. And when you said something is unforgivable, where do you go? It's like that you're now at an impasse. You can say that's illegal. We're going to litigate. We're going to make those people who've done that thing, you know, accountable for what they've done, and then there's some kind of reparation. But if you say it's unforgivable, then you're in really kind of dodgy water.
Yeah, and it's more, I suppose, the statement that something's unforgivable, if I'm hearing you right so far, does something to the person that makes that decision. That's a very destructive position to take in a life, that something someone else or that we ourselves have done. And I would love to reflect on self forgiveness, because I think a lot of people who struggle with complex fatigue conditions can get very frustrated with themselves, can have a lot of frustration and maybe even shame about the symptoms, certainly lots of resentment towards their own body. And I think it would be interesting to explore that aspect of this as well, Barbara. If you've got any thoughts on that, I'd really welcome them.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think there's three different angles or three different things that you can think about with forgiveness. I don't know. I need to come up with a different word. Categories, maybe. One is the things that we need to forgive. So things that happen in our childhood. Because for me, my sort of overarching thing is everyone needs to forgive everyone for everything all the time. So that's really like, that's my basic approach, but it's very general and lots of people can't relate to it. But every child has parents, so they're either present or not present, either their original parents or not their original parents, siblings or no siblings, other family members, early school experiences, other friends, growing up, first love experiences, accidents, you know, first pet dying, you know, like if you think about through the average, you know, life, you know, we're talking about Western lives primarily, but you know, in an average life, there are going to be things where that things are different from the way you would like them to be. No one has perfect parents. You know, forgiving your parents is like forgiveness 101. You start, you know, it's not often where people start actually, because it's quite challenging, because it then some people have an inner taboo of criticizing their parents, because as we grow up, we know our parents were doing the best they could with what they had at the time. But there's probably a younger you in there going, actually, that really didn't work for me. That really didn't work for me. This need wasn't met. I wasn't seen. And funnily enough, after having done, I think, thousands of processes with people over the last 30 years, when I work with people and their younger self, I have never heard someone say, I wish you'd bought me more stuff, to their parents. All they want, I wish you'd given me the attention that I needed. I wish you'd asked me about me, or, you know, so there's the sort of, the lack is often in just being seen, being appreciated just as you are, and knowing that you're enough. That's sort of, you know, I think culturally there's, like, you know, we're talking at the beginning about culturally, there's definitely an impact about how we think about our mental and emotional health and how we parent. And we're a long way, I think, in terms of how amazing our technology is and how uneducated we are as human beings about our inner life. You know, we even talk about mental health without referring to emotions. To me, just seems utterly, you know, we're talking about really about, yes, mental, your attitude and everything, but the impact of your thinking on your feeling, and then your feelings. We're hopeless, especially Brits, hopeless with our emotions. You know, so back to that's what the one category is: the people and things that we need to forgive, which can include illness and your physical body. Then there's the things that we want others to forgive us for, and God bless Prince Harry, he really wants to be forgiven. But he can't do anything about that to get the other people to forgive him. So that means that you're a bit stuck. It's another reason why doing forgiveness processing works, because it helps to relieve that pain. And then the last one is forgiving ourselves, which often is hard because we know we're probably the most bitter and judgmental of ourselves. And it's harder to get distance, you know, so I do teach that in a slightly different way.
Mm.
So I help everyone to sort of like look at their internal judgments and the beliefs, the core beliefs, guiding beliefs about themselves first before we do the forgiveness practice.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because one theme that comes a lot from people working with fatigue is that in this concept of the inner critic. And of course, the inner critic is pretty unforgiving, right?
Awful. Yeah, 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 yeah.
And we all have it, And so, what in practical terms, when you're faced with someone with a strong inner critic, where do you take them first, Barbara, in to help them loosen out that and really allow themselves to experience their self-forgiveness?
Well, two things. It depends on how I was working with them. If I was working with them one to one, then I would probably invite the session to be dedicated to going back to the root of that belief, because often we know, like, I don't have any self-confidence, or one of the first things I trained with the More to Life program was to teach a self-esteem course, and I knew I needed to teach it because I wanted to learn it so badly, and that's what made me a good teacher of it, was having had inner beliefs. I'm not good enough, I don't matter, I'm evil, even because I was brought up in the Catholic faith. And yeah, so that gives you, it gives you many blessings, but it also gives you quite a tough inheritance in terms of those core beliefs about you're born with a stain of sin on your soul and you're irredeemable, and therefore you have to spend your whole life repenting, which I now don't believe, but it took a lot for me to work that inner belief about I'm evil and now I'm an abomination of all that is unlike the light and life of, like, ugh. You can really, it goes really deep, and it doesn't even feel like necessarily mine. And so sometimes those beliefs, so it might be that the people who are suffering from, like the fatigue syndromes, might be carrying a really old pattern that's not even theirs, that they come in carrying. So I that would be one way if I was working one-to-one. In the groups, I do more exploratory about actually looking at the inner critic. And then this was another technique that I learned with the More to Life program, where you listen to your mind talk, and like, I'm not good enough. And if I'm not good enough, then everything I do will be rubbish. And if everything I do is rubbish, then, and you kind of do this thing where you're laddering down, you're sort of going, and then, and if, and then, fundamentally. And if ultimately you end up at a core belief, like, fundamentally I don't matter, or I'm nothing, and I think what's wonderful as well to know is that we're all like that, deep down. So, or anybody who's inclined to do this kind of work is find some kind of I'm not enough, I don't matter, or I'm evil, or something. And wonderful is, and then you go back over each piece of the mind talk and you just ask yourself, and this is a bit like the Byron Katie work, but I like this nuance, which is to ask, is it true? Is it false? Or is it something that I don't know? Which
Good
is
one.
really good. The don't know is a blessed relief. I don't know how you should be. I don't know how the future should be. I don't know how my life should be. So that kind of relieves of all our kind of trying to predict how, our wishing things were different. But then also the don't know is, I don't know what, like, how do I know what enough is? I'm saying I'm not enough, but like, on what criteria? How could I possibly know what that is? So that it also helps you to wiggle free from those, because some of the other approaches to mental health can be, say something, like a core belief, and then you say what's positive about it, which sometimes we find hard to relate to, and the positive version of it isn't actually, it's equally untrue. So if you said I'm selfish, and then you said, oh, well, the counter to that is I'm unselfish. Actually, sometimes I'm selfish, sometimes I'm unselfish. So do you see what I mean? So then you may as well not be verifying at all. So I like the idea of saying, is it true? Is it false? Is it something I don't know? And then actually saying what the truth is, which is sometimes I'm selfish, or sometimes I can be incredibly generous.
Yeah. And I guess being okay with that, right?
Yeah.
Accepting one's fundamental humanity and allowing for the creatureliness of us as, animal bodies as well, with hard baked in biological survival instincts that sometimes complicate our more elevated aspirations.
I love that. creatureliness. And do you know the work of the evolutionary biologists Michael Dowd and Connie Barlow?
No, no.
They talk about the four different parts of the brain. So the kind of the most ancient part is the lizard, your lizard legacy. So that's the reptilian parted colored part of us that wants to survive. Then you've got your furry little mammal that wants to connect and, like nerd, that sort of thing. Then you've got your monkey mind, which is very clever and wants to work out how to get its needs met. And then you've got your higher porpoise, which is your prefrontal cortex that doesn't finish developing till you're 25. But I love it because then you really get a sense of these creatures do not live happily with each other inside of us. And sometimes we're driven to do things which Gabor Mate and Thomas Hubel might call very intelligent coping mechanisms.
Yes.
So like comfort eating, very intelligent coping mechanism if you're not nourished by your family of origin. But so there's also something about having a forgiving attitude towards yourself for the funny little ways that we all develop in order to survive our childhoods.
And I'm very struck there how understanding the biology of that makes it more accessible, right? When we understand how we're put together and how it works, it's easier to realize that it's not pathological. We are just another normal human being negotiating these different evolutionary layers of self. And that somehow, I think, takes some of the shame out of it when we understand, the fundamentally biological nature of some of those foundations. And also appreciating the adaptive dimensions of certain behavioral adaptations, because they are actually resource states when they occur. What I do at 3 to avoid my father's anger can be extremely, extremely resourceful, but might not serve me when I'm 45 in a relationship.
Exactly. Which is why it's worth doing the work to go back to when those beliefs were created, those adaptations were created, and working them in any particular works for you. I mean, I love Ken Wilber's 3-2-1 process,
yes,
where you see it as an inanimate object or some kind of metaphor, and you work with it. You see it, and then you become it. You see it, you speak to it, and then you become it, and then you can invite it. And usually, you can ask, when did you come? When was the first time you came to help Anna or Barbara? And then you'd have an age when something changed or happened that then needs to be addressed.
That really reminds me of some of the parts work I do with hypnosis, speaking directly to aspects of the unconscious self, these neural clusters that develop their own personalities, and I believe even have their own eye prescriptions, extraordinary complexity in the brain.
Yes.
So coming back to illness and forgiveness, are there particular insights around the release of energy in particular? Because I'm very aware that when we unconsciously repress material, it is exhausting at some level. And it seems to me, and I don't know what your observation of this, Barbara, is, it seems to me that people get to a certain age or stage and things just come knocking them. The things that, have been left there for decades and not faced seem to emerge, whether through symptoms of illness, whether through psychic states, whether through pains that come up in meditation, whatever it is, things seem to arise and emerge for resolution. So I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I sometimes think of it as every moment is a doorway to what hasn't been healed. And I think maybe we get better as we get older at noticing, or we get so many reminders from life that eventually we go, oh, okay, I'll go back and I'll look at that thing then if I have to. I mean, I would love it to work with younger people, to save them the trouble of waiting until they're in their 40s and 50s and having lived through their, maladaptations, probably. I mean, very intelligent at the time, but like as you get older. But I also wonder whether or not it is just life just has its timing. I don't know if you've had that experience where you there's a certain readiness. You maybe you need to feel at least willing to face those things, and also maybe culturally we are only now discovering this is really important work that we do. Because when I was growing up, like, sort of, I think anybody who was seeing a psychotherapist was because they had severe, like, psychiatric problems, or there was such a stigma to it. Whereas now, it's like, it's much more ubiquitous. It's much more much more understanding, like, we all need to take care of our mental health. And plus the fact everything has intensified in terms of the things that we have to cope with as human beings.
Yeah.
And especially the global picture right now is that we have kind of like a humanitarian existential crisis on our hands, and almost no tools or no resources to actually be meeting that consciously. And I think probably those of us who have started on a spiritual path might be a bit further down that road going, oh yes, we really need to be doing something about this, rather than trying to ignore it. But I totally agree with you about sublimating and how that can energetically make a big impact on your your whole system, really. But one of the things I get told the most about when people finish doing their forgiveness process is they feel lighter across the board. So there's something that, and we're not, I think some of the problem with forgiveness is that we don't realize that that could help, because we think that it might be all the things that we're afraid it might be, and it will make us vulnerable, and we don't know how to do it. And like, well, isn't it better just to not talk about those things? I'm over them. I don't need to talk about those things because I've understood it as an adult. And my take is, yes, you need to go back. You need to do whatever healing needs to happen so that you can free that pattern, like you were saying, the clusters. You need to be able to, like, come to completion.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it's easy to forget, isn't it, that some of these things are just somatically held. They're not even accessible to cognitive methods. They're not even accessible to talking.
Yeah.
You actually have to do the somatic work and
Yes.
really go down into those layers if you're going to liberate that material.
Yeah.
I'm more struck by what you were saying about the meta picture of, human consciousness. And what we're saying here about the surfacing of things at a certain stage of life that need dealing with, it reminds me of the talk about bifurcation points. It seems as though individuals reach these crisis points, bifurcation points, where either the system is going to break down or evolve, and typically we evolve because we're flexible systems. And I'm just wondering, I want to link this back to what we're saying about forgiveness in the field, because perhaps there's something here as well for us collectively, that the individual work we do on forgiveness and working through and healing our pains and resentments, as that feeds into the field, perhaps that also feeds the kind of energetic balance of a potential bifurcation point. And I think we are approaching one as humanity. We are approaching a point where we can foreseeably see the breakdown of civilization potentially, or an evolutionary stretch into something much more collectively reconciled, intelligent, and evolved.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. And in fact, one of the other things why I call myself a forgiveness enthusiast is because the potential of forgiveness. So we said for the next 2 weeks, we're all going to take time. We're going to make a list of all the people who we need to forgive. So even if we think we've done it, just for hygiene's sake. And this is what I do with the forgiveness field. I get people to write the list. And when I first had the opportunity to do this, I got to number 36 before I thought of my mother. Because pretty much everyone I've ever met. So I just started, just like brainstormed. And I still, to this day, still keep a list, which luckily is much smaller because I've done quite a lot of work. But I still keep one, which means it's an ongoing thing. Because you never say, oh, I've done yoga. It's like, well, you've done yoga for today, but you still need to practice. So I think of forgiveness as a practice. And then I get people to mark like a 1 to 10, like how big of a deal is it? So it's a little thing or it's a big thing. And you can mark a 1 to 10. And then I get them to add up the number of years they've held the resentment, which is really fun if you're working with mostly middle-aged people. You get thousands in a group, thousands of years worth of resentment. And so if you think about, that's what we're all carrying. But if we took 2 weeks to go, okay, I'm going to clear that, and there was no resentment in your heart at all for anyone, that makes me go tingly when I even talk about it. But just like the potential of it. And then we could, because we know we can do things that suddenly it's short, like we did in 2020, we could do that. And then where would we be in terms of how do we want to continue as a humanity? What are our priorities? Do we really want to put this amount of money into weaponry, or do we want to put it into, other projects? So it's kind of that technically is a possibility for humanity that we're not taking. Why? So that, I mean, for me, the feel thing is really important, and it matters that we each do our work. So I don't know if you remember the game Stuck in the Mud. Do you ever play that when you're a girl?
Yeah.
So those of us who can get free every now and then run under the legs of the other people to help them get free, and then we get stuck again, and then someone comes and helps us. So it's like, so we're in this game of Stuck in the Mud where we can our forgiveness. I mean, I say this at the end of my book. Your forgiveness is an act of amnesty for the whole of humanity.
Yeah.
That's how we create peace in the world, is one heart at a time. And I know there are probably people who are not very interested in forgiveness, but if we had a sea change, and if we believe what's true about evolutionary change, is you only really need about 10% of something to create the beginning of the change. So I mean, that's why I feel excited by the potential of forgiveness, because I just, even if it's getting to the end of your life and going on your deathbed, just going, yeah, amazing, rather than being on your deathbed going,
exactly. Exactly so. But again, thinking about the field and the collective, there's an ongoingness, an attitudinal ongoingness that you're talking about here. It's a stance, isn't it? It's a commitment to a certain way of living, a certain open-heartedness, a certain willingness to be flexible, to understand perhaps others. Resentment, I think, locks us into a very binary, polar kind of relationality with someone. Whereas I think when we forgive, there's an ability to start to empathize, to stand in their shoes. Even someone who's done something horrific, when we forgive, as you said, justice can still be done. There's still a sense of restorative justice. But restorative justice, I think, is in itself a magnificently liberating form of justice. It's not punitive. It has within it the capacity to be so painful in the right confrontation, the self-confronting sense, that it allows for redemption. It allows something very redemptive to arise from it. So this practice that you're talking about is incredibly deep and transformative. And for those who are ill, many of whom are isolated in their beds or in their houses, it's a very radical contribution, isn't it, to humanity and to the flourishing of humanity.
Yeah. And it's very doable, even if you have limited mobility or limited energy. I mean, you don't have to forgive everybody on the same day. You could, the forgiveness fields are 90 minutes, and the first half an hour is introduction and a bit of prep. So the actual process itself takes less than 45 minutes. I mean, it was slightly longer than that when I work one-to-one with people, because we do a bit more all-encompassing, but you could free your heart a little bit of one grievance, at least, in under an hour. So it's I think it's quite a good deal to be able to change those things that you think you can never change. And like you're saying, it is about having more compassion about, for the grace of God go I. And one of the other things that happens, because one of the parts of the process is where you take the other person's position and you speak as them. Often clients are surprised at their level of insight about the other person. They're like, wow, I didn't really realize that before. So it's like the collective field, if you like, our ability to access, like in family constellations, you can access information that you don't even know that you can access. And there's something incredible about that.
Yeah, absolutely. That ties in with all the theorization about the holographic universe, doesn't it? And the idea that every molecule contains all the information in the whole, and also studies of human consciousness that show that we actually have the capacity to plug into that in a very profound way, which I suppose leads us straight back to spirituality, doesn't it? Because
Yeah.
I was just listening to, I think it's Jude Currivan, who was talking about one of her books about the kind of 21st century physics that really is even more radical, I think, than quantum theory, and it's starting to show the kind of nature of reality is Indra's net, the idea that it's this vast network of light, and that ultimately everything is light. We're light, we're waveforms for light and all this. And I just find all this mind-blowing, but of course it lends so much power to practices like the practices you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think of forgiveness as master spiritual practice. Even though meditation is amazing, so is forgiveness. It's like you can meditate for decades and never forgive a soul. Equally, you can do all your work, all your forgiveness work and never, become enlightened. So, there are different purposes, if you like, but really important that forgiveness is recognized, because it's the same kind of thing for the heart as meditation in mind. Meditation is about letting go and recognizing your true nature. Forgiveness is about the same, but in your heart, letting go of wanting the other person different, which is a complete waste of your time, because they're not and they haven't been, and you can't change it. So you may as well accept it. But we hold on so tight to our version of how we want things to be. So it's a mighty relief and release to be able to let it go.
Yeah.
And I think it's the hardest thing.
It is, and yet then life becomes so much easier than you ever imagined once you let go. Yeah. Because the old saying, isn't it, let go and let God, whatever you understand that to mean. God isn't always a helpful word, but letting go and trusting life, trusting consciousness is an extraordinarily relaxing way to live. Even when you have deep psychic material coming up, there's a capacity to be such a space that it just arises and moves through and goes away. So I'm assuming you can get to the point with forgiveness, Barbara, that you can become so expert at it that you can literally just think of someone and let it go.
I am, as I said, an enthusiast, which I also mean nerd about it. And I think you probably can. Sometimes if you get hooked, I would think sometimes a bit like forgiveness is like Velcro. You get hooked onto the other person, and what it does is it helps you to be like Teflon. So if someone does something that annoys you, it just slides off you. But I know from my own practice that I do tell a story in the book about this, where there was a woman who quite a few friends said, oh, you should meet her. I'm sure you get on really well. And we ended up going to the same dance class. And I said, oh, would you like a lift home? And she went, no, thanks. I like to be on my own. I'm like, oh, okay. And then, so I did my forgiveness work, because that's what I'm like. And then the next time I encountered her was in the health food shop locally. And I was in a real rush. And I said, oh, can I just kind of push in front of you just to get this one thing? And she went, oh, good. And I'm like, I've just done my forgiveness work on you. I'll do it again. And so I did some more forgiveness work on her, clear my field. And we are really good friends now. And I don't think we would ever become really good friends if I hadn't been willing to keep doing my forgiveness work. Yeah. And that's the thing. And yes, I think it's right what you're saying is, like, as you become less of a collector of your resentments, it is easier to let go. It's faster for me to be able to see, oh, I'm holding on to that. But even still, sometimes I leave people on my forgiveness list for a while. And a friend of mine said this to me as well. She said, you know what, after I read your book, I realized how much I enjoy my resentments.
They can be very rewarding, right?
Exactly. So you have to really watch out for your tendency to just like judging the other person. But that's another thing that I kind of unpack in my book, which is like the payoffs for holding the resentment, but also the massive downsides. Because I think we're under an illusion that somehow our hate is helping or our resentment is helping, because it's like saying, we're doing the right thing for the right reasons, or I'm on the side of the righteous, or if I step down and forgive that thing, then it makes it look like I'm agreeing with it, so we all have that, those internal things. But if we can really look at, it's a bit like a Swizz. Resentment it's not going to get you what you think it's going to get you. It's not going to, your hate doesn't help. Okay. Yeah. I mean, there's a really lovely Maya Angelou quote, which is, hate it is something like, it's never solved a problem.
Yes, like, absolutely.
So,
and it's a very false sense of empowerment in it, isn't it? very false.
Yeah.
Um, who
Yeah.
was it that
I
talks
think
about anger? Was it the Buddha who said, I don't know if it's the Buddha or someone else, who said about anger having a honeyed tip but a poisoned stem? Is that the
nice.
Buddha?
Yeah, yeah, that's lovely. Yeah, because there's lots of really good quotes about resentment. One is it's like drinking poison and hoping the other person will die.
Mm,
Or my particular favorite was like setting yourself on fire and hoping the other person would be bothered by the smoke.
yeah,
Because we're the ones who are carrying it, and the etymology of the word resent is sentir, to feel, so you're re-feeling it, feeling it again. And again, if you're in any state of health where you don't want to have any of that negative energy, rolling through your body, and you can do something about it, then for me it's a no-brainer.
yeah,
At least
absolutely.
start there.
Absolutely. And I'm remembering now that in a conversation with Dr. Keisha Ewers, she said that she discovered autoimmune conditions are undigested or unmetabolized anger. And so, from that, we can just extrapolate the idea that resentment held over time becomes illness, can easily become illness, can get locked in the body in ways that are destructive to well-being.
Yeah, yeah. And there have been studies done, probably more to do with cardiovascular well-being, but high blood pressure, incidence of strokes and heart attacks, and just cortisol levels, those kinds of things, that they've already studied a relationship between forgiveness and those
Yeah.
markers,
Yeah.
which is not incredible, is it?
No, it's predictable. Now, I've got one last question for you, which is, how would someone know that they were carrying unconscious resentment or lack of forgiveness? How would they know? How would that show up, maybe?
Two possibilities. One is that something that looks like it's unrelated triggers you. So it can be like a neighbor, or something that's more of an everyday thing, can feel more impactful than perhaps the actual incident warrants.
Hmm.
So that would be one clue. So I mean, this is also my personal practice, which is when I get triggered by something, I look like I'm okay. So what's that connected to, that needs a refreshing view? I might need to go over some of the material again. And I think that's the other thing as well about forgiveness, is it is rinse and repeat. Like I said about the yoga practice, it's like something that we do even if we've forgiven one person. I forgave my mum before she died, and then since she's been dead several times, because different come up, different aspects of our relationship have come up to be healed. So I work with that. And then the other much more obvious one is, are you talking about them or thinking about them the following Wednesday? When something's happening, you're just like, and it's on your mind, or they're in bed with you, and they should be in bed with you because they're on your mind. You don't want them there, so that would be a clue. And in fact, I think we're sensitive to this with other people. When somebody keeps going on about their mother-in-law, or their sister, or blah blah, we're sensitive. If you've told that story 3 times, you need to do your forgiveness work. Then
Yes, absolutely.
yes,
And the story isn't helpful usually either.
no, exactly. And it's not, I don't think it's anything that we admire. You'd never put on your dating profile, bears resentments and grudges for years, never lets you off the hook. It's just not an attractive quality. So
No, it's not. And that's the wrong kind of ongoingness, isn't it? We're talking about a fundamental shift in the direction of ongoingness towards a radical commitment to an open heart, letting go,
yeah.
doing the deep work, facing the pain, letting that go, forgiving. It's all
Yeah.
beautiful, important, healing work.
Exactly. And one last thing to say, which also might be related to the illness profile, is about, I agree about anger, but also grief. I
Yeah.
think forgiveness and grief are sisters, and
Mm.
that when you admit you're holding resentment, sometimes you then have to unpack the grief. You have
Yeah.
to feel it. I think resentment can act like a shield over the pain, and
Yes.
that can be really important to
Yeah.
just
I
be aware of.
Yeah, and I guess that goes with hardening, doesn't it? The idea of creating a shell. But of course, what you resent is actually locked inside with you, not held outside. It's like
Exactly.
building a wall and then realizing, oh my God, it's in here with me.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
brilliant.
Yeah.
It's been so good to talk to you, Barbara. I'm really grateful. I want to thank you on behalf of the audience.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure. Great conversation.
I've really loved it. Thank you.
Yeah.